Romans chapter 1. One of the things I was thinking about during Jason's prayer tonight, Job had things going on in his life that he didn't understand, that he was confused by, and obviously many of those things were hurtful and negative to him. But what was the approach that God took with Job to help him where he couldn't understand how life was going and why it was going a certain way? What was the approach God took with Job? That's right. Backed him up to the big picture and said, were you there when, and started naming these different things in creation. And it showed Job the magnitude of God's power and God's wisdom. Well, it so happens tonight we get to do something similar as we turn a page in our nation's history. We get to talk about the big picture tonight, and that's to look at the magnificence and the magnitude of God's power. Here's how Paul says it in Romans chapter 1, in verse 18. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse." The psalmist says it this way, that the heavens declare the glory of His handiwork. And that's what we get to explore tonight. We're on this subject about how did we get here. And along the way, we used this illustration last week. We gave a family the project of putting together a puzzle. Where's Kevin? Kevin Broom. Am I just ringy, or is it just me? I'm ringing in my own head. There's always an echo in my head anyway, with all the empty space, so I thought maybe it's just me. All right. Can you hit the James Earl Jones button? That's the one that I want, kind of that. That one's not working. Okay, I'm going to get the Pee Wee Herman buttons. What's going to happen? I asked him to put together a puzzle last week, but I left out a key piece, even though I gave them all of the puzzle pieces. What was the part I didn't give them? Do you remember? I didn't give them the lid. I didn't give them the box top. And we noticed how difficult it is to put together a puzzle if you don't have the box top, because the box top shows you how the pieces go together or what it's supposed to look like when you're done. And so our challenge in this conversation, I'm encouraging you each week to grab one thing, just one thing. Maybe last week it was the puzzle box. One thing that you can go, okay, I can talk about that. I can remember that. Because what we're doing in the world right now is we're asking, where do you go to find the box top? What is the meaning of life? How do you put together life? When you talk about these questions about what is the meaning of life, is there a right and wrong? Is there a morality? Do we have a destination? What's our origin? Where do we come from? Does it matter if we're here? How we answer those questions is going to come from our box top. What's the overall view? All right, I'm a little excited tonight, so I'm talking too fast. I can tell by the look on your face. So y'all wake up and catch up. That's the solution. All right. Now, as we start in this conversation, there's a big if. There's a question with two possible answers, and it's about whether or not God exists. So if there is a God, then there's some pieces that come together. If that's the box top, if God has the box top, then number one, we have an ultimate meaning and an ultimate purpose. We're going to be described as God's children, God's special creation, that we've been created on purpose, with purpose, that we have an eternal destination. Number two, if there is a God, that means there is ultimately a right and a wrong way to live. And that standard is going to be created by the owner of the box top. Because whoever built the puzzle gets to decide what it's going to be. Thirdly, that means there'll be a destiny that has consequence. Because if there's a right and a wrong, and if we were to choose to live right, then there's a certain outcome. If we were to choose to live wrong, then there's a different outcome. Those are just three ways that if there is a God, there's a significant difference in how we're going to live. Contrast that, if you will. If there is no God, then number one, your life has no meaning and no purpose. I'm not trying to be negative or pejorative, but if you are the result of a biological accident, then you're a nothing and a nobody. You are a mutated species that'll be here for a bit. If there is no God, there's no way to define meaning or purpose to our life. We're merely an accident. It also means there is no right and wrong, because it's survival of the fittest. It's whoever can get what they can get. It will be difficult, I'm going to argue impossible, to have any moral code if there is no God. Because it'll come back to, says who? Says who? Now, the strange thing is, we're kind of living in the middle right now, in my opinion, of our society, in that we don't want to really recognize God, but we want a standard of morality. And we adjust it to our own circumstances, but most of us don't want to be murdered. Most of us don't want somebody else taking our stuff. Most of us are incensed when some CEO somewhere steals money from the pension fund. And so, all of us have some kind of moral standard that we will get outraged about. And of course, we're arguing about what it is because we're still arguing about whether there is one. But if there is no God, there is no moral standard, and there couldn't be. And your destiny is dust. That when you die, your body's going to decompose back to dust, and that's it. Nothing else. And if that's true, then go for it. Do all that you can do. Get everything you can get in life, because that's all there is, which is a very different lifestyle or life direction than if there is a God and there is a destiny and there are consequences. Does that make sense so far? That's why this is the question about the box top. This is what tells us how to put together the pieces. And so now we've been asking, so how much faith do we have? Because our choices are either someone created something out of nothing, and that takes faith. This is what we talked about last week, because was anybody there when the universe began? Anybody? Anybody? A few of you are older than me, but I don't know if anybody's that old. So if none of us are there, and there was no video camera setting off on the side, so it is a matter of faith. It is a matter of belief, hope, conviction, and assurance in something we haven't seen. Whoever you are, or however you answer the question, because none of us were there. So either someone created something out of nothing, or no one created something out of nothing. Because here we are, we're something. And so that's what begs the question, how did it get here, which we get into specifically tonight, which gives us one of two choices. There is either an intelligent being that created complex life forms, this is 2 weeks from now, or non-intelligent natural forces randomly created such complex life. As Paul just told us in Romans, we're going to have all kinds of illustrations to choose from to talk about the complexity of life form here on this planet. And it's just stunning how incredibly complex what we see around us is. And I'm going to introduce you to the Hawaiian bobtail squid, because I think he's one of the most interesting squids I've ever met. How about you? And these are the way we're going to have to answer this. This is either a complex life form as a result of intelligent design, or it's a result of an accident. And that's how we're going to have to deal with that. This is the word we're going to use for tonight. We're going to use the word surge to represent 5 points. If you can remember one of them, I'm not saying you can't remember them all, but I don't know about you. If I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody out in public, if I can get one of these out, then that's fantastic. So hopefully one of these will kind of tickle your fancy or touch the way you think or what you're interested in. There are 3 levels that we'll cover. The first one is tonight, the cosmological evidence for the existence of God. That's the big picture. We'll zoom in on what's called the teleological or the microscopic view. But the most interesting component is also going to be the very nature of moral law. I'd never thought about before as the evidence for God's existence. We'll get to talk about that in a couple of weeks. What I'm about to show you is logical, but I'm going to ask you if it's true. Because you can have a rational discussion that can be based on a false premise. So that's what I'm going to ask you. It's going to be 3 parts. I'll just show you all 3. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the conclusion is the universe had a cause. Now, as far as the flow of logic, this is going to be logical, but are the premises true? We'll start with the first one. Everything that had a beginning has a cause. This is the foundational principle of science. That if something is, it's because it was caused. And the exploration of cause is through observation, through testing of evidence, we theorize why it happened or how it happened. So that brings us to number 2. This is going to be our discussion tonight. So, did the universe have a beginning? Because those who are not wanting to believe in God will say there is no such thing as an eternal God. Then when you ask the question, okay, where did the universe come from? Then one of the answers is it's always been here. There's no beginning, there's no cause. And so what you're left with is a choice of either an eternal God or an eternal universe. Those are your two choices. Now, next week, we'll get to talk about where God came from, and that's gonna hurt my head, so you're going to have to come help. But we're going to give it a shot. But for tonight, either God is eternal or the universe is eternal. That's why the second point right here is the foundation for this conversation. So we're going to use 5 scientific examples to show that the universe has had a beginning. Because if it's had a beginning, then it has a cause, which will lead us to then who is the causer? That's where that finally ends up. Any questions so far? Raise your hand if you're awake. That's what I thought. Okay. The S in the word surge, we're going to use to represent the second law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is that the universe has a finite amount of energy. So the second law is, and that energy is getting used up. If I were to describe a car, the first law says that when you bought your car, the dealer gave it to you with a full tank of gas just out of the goodness of their heart. Okay? The first law of thermodynamics says you never get to put more gas in the car. It has a finite, it has a certain amount of energy. That's it. There's no refills. If that law is true, then the second law is, and you will eventually what? Run out of gas. Well, if I were to have this lay in here, I won't try not to shine it in your eyes. Signal you. Did you get all that? Okay. If you were walking along and you saw, this is Halloween, I'll give you this. If you saw this setting somewhere with the light on, maybe I'll shine it up. When you see this, what can you assume about this flashlight? Okay. If you were to look at this, and if I were to ask you, how long has this flashlight been here? You have a hint. Okay. Would you conclude, looking at this flashlight, that this flashlight has existed forever? And the reason you know that's not true, because the light's still on. Because the second law of thermodynamics is eventually the energy in the batteries will be consumed. So if this flashlight has always existed, you should find it like this. Out of energy. If it's always existed forever. Even if you want to say, these are super batteries. These are 47 million year batteries. Okay, fine. But if it's been on forever, it's still off. Because it'll eventually run out of fuel. Some other examples of thermodynamics, the other concept is that energy is being used and not replaced, or you go from order to disorder. Things start off in order, and things go to disorder. About 3.5 weeks ago, Root left, and the house was in order. It is not my fault, it's physics. I didn't get a lot of sleep Monday night because I was trying to revert the second law of thermodynamics back to order. In other words, if you look at a glass and it has ice in it, you can make a judgment about how long it's been sitting there because there's still ice in it. If you look at order to disorder, what are the chances of getting toothpaste back in the tube? Okay, pretty slim. To go from order to disorder, it doesn't go from disorder to order. By the way, that is the foundational creation block of evolution, is that things go from disorder to order, that you have mutations and chaos, and that evolves into a better, higher, more sophisticated form, which is the opposite of the scientific understanding of the second law of thermodynamics. Things don't go that way. They go from organized to disorganized. Another example could be radioactivity in the Earth's crust, rocks. We have all different types of isotopes that have half-lives, right? They decay through radiation, and it takes hundreds of thousands of years per half-life, right? If the Earth has been around since forever, what would you not have in rocks? You wouldn't have any more radiation. It'd all be gone. So the fact that there is still energy being depleted tells you that the universe had to have a beginning. Another way to think about it is if you were to look at the video of the universe and then hit rewind, you're going to see it back up to a place where it started, because the flashlight battery going dead, the ice melting, radioactivity in rock says there is coming a time when the universe is going to go dark and cold. So if it has an end, it's also going to have a beginning. Secondly, is the idea of an expanding universe. Albert Einstein, in the first part of the 1900s, began to develop what he would later call the theory of relativity. And from a mathematical perspective, he came to some conclusions that he called them irritating facts. That from his study mathematically, it seemed to him that the universe was expanding, that it was growing larger, that the galaxies were moving further apart from each other. It was actually observed by Edwin Hubble in 1929 at the Wilson Observatory in California. Our telescopes finally got good enough that he began to observe what's called red light shift in looking at the stars. What that means is, it's a Doppler effect. If the first example is, does anybody remember when jam boxes were that big? We had little headphones in a huge box. Now we have little tiny players in huge headphones. It's called the evolution of a teenager, but anyway. If you set a boombox, that's what we called them. If you set a boombox on the ground, then the sound waves emanating from that would be identical all the way around it. I mean, it might be louder in front of the speaker, but as far as the distance in the sound waves would be the same because it's not moving. But the reason when an ambulance goes by you, or a train, for example, that's moving down the tracks, and he hits his horn, he goes, whoa, and the sound drops in pitch as it goes by, whether it's an ambulance or a train or an airplane or anything else, it's because if the sound's coming at you, because there's forward velocity, the sound waves are being compressed, because it's pushing against the sound or pushing it along like a snowplow, if you will. And as you compress the sound waves, the frequency goes up. When it goes past you, now it's going away, and so it's dragging the sound with it. Of course, the faster the speed, the more pronounced this is. But even when your little toddler goes by, there's a Doppler effect because they're fast enough, okay? And so as the sound waves get drugged or separated, then the frequency drops and you hear the pitch and the sound change. Well, light is the same function, that it moves in a wave, electromagnetic wave propagation also. So if the light's coming at you, it's the same effect. Those light waves are being compressed, and that shifts. In sound, we had the pitch change from high to low. Right? You want me to do that again? I can go from low to high. So that's about as high as I can get. Light, what light does is shift in the spectrum, and it's not sound, it's color. So blue is higher on the frequency than red is. So if it's coming at you, it's going to be higher toward the blue spectrum. And when it passes you, it's going to get stretched out, and the light spectrum moves closer to the red. I can remember it because it's like seeing taillights. Taillights are red. They're going away from you. So what happened is, the point of all this is, they finally get good enough telescopes, they start looking at the stars, and they start seeing a lot of taillights. The light has shifted more toward the red spectrum, which is the evidence of things moving away from us. Well, if things are moving away and you pause the tape and you rewind it, then what happens? They come back to a beginning. If the universe has always existed, everything should be steady. There's some, when this was discovered, this was disconcerting for us astronomers that didn't care for the implications. So one of the theories was an oscillating universe, or the universe expands to a certain point and then it collapses, goes boom again and expands and it oscillates. And it's still eternal even if it's spreading. A couple of problems with that is our good old friend, second law of thermodynamics says, one, there's not enough mass in the universe to pull it back. There's not enough mass, gravitational force to grab those stars, slow them down, and bring them back. It's too late. The gate's been left open. The second one is thermodynamics says, if I take this basketball and I drop it from this height, when it bounces, will it return to the same height? No, because it's losing energy. It's not gaining energy. So if I drop it, what happens is I get a few oscillations, but eventually it stops. If the universe was oscillating, then this law would say that eventually, even if it was doing that, although there's not enough mass, gravitational force to do that, if it did do it, it would eventually stop. So if it's always existed, it should have been stopped by now. And then thirdly, even if we could toss out the second law of thermodynamics and say, okay, it's oscillating, it still started the first time. And where did it come from? You're still stuck with the same problem. Whether it is expanding or whether it's oscillating, you end up with the same, yeah, but it had to have a beginning somewhere. So a second piece is the Doppler effect or the red light shift or the expanding universe. The universe is getting bigger, and not just space itself is getting bigger. So just hit rewind and then ask yourself, what was that moment? And what was before that? Does that make sense so far? Okay, we're just going to go on. This one's interesting, the idea of radiation in space, because as the initial point, you can call it a Big Bang or the explosion or the starting point of the universe, whichever you prefer. But other scientists said, okay, we see the red light shift, but if everything happened like that in just this instant, it's all just there. By the way, when God talks to Job, he talks about who spread out the stars. If all this just happened, then man, you're talking about light and matter and energy just coming into existence all at once, and that would leave an afterglow. That would leave a shadow. There should be some sort of leftover effect from that, because space is an amazing museum. The spaces are so vast that when light comes at us from stars, by the time you and I perceive it, it is many, many hundreds and thousands of years old by the time we see it, because it's traveled so far to get here. It is possible that every star in the universe has already exploded and we still don't know it. Isn't that comforting? Space is so big, it's a living museum, because what we're seeing is the past. Because it takes hundreds of thousands of years for light to get to us from the different directions and distances. And so the point is, with all this space, there ought to be some sort of leftover effect. Well, pigeons to the rescue. In 1948, there were two fellas in New Jersey, of all places, had their antenna, and they were measuring signals they were getting from space, and they kept getting a background radiation. And I thought, what in the world is that? And so in 1948, that's when scientists theorized there should be an afterglow or an effect. In 1965, there's two guys in New Jersey, and they're tuning their antenna, and they keep getting this radiation no matter where they tune their antenna, and they said it's pigeons. So they had the pigeons removed and the pigeon droppings removed, because you know how birds set on antennas. They got all that cleaned up, and it was still there. They eventually got a Pulitzer Prize out of it, because they discovered the background radiation to the beginning of the universe. That what they found was the leftover heat signatures that somewhere in like the microwave radiation wavelength of our microwaves the next time you cook a hot dog or something. They picked up the patterns out in space that was consistent with what was theorized in 1948. Well, that was pretty interesting. But in 1989, NASA spent $200 million launching a satellite called the COBE Explorer. It had a higher resolution that could detect not only radiation, but heat signatures. And they mapped the radiation because they said, if this is really the leftovers from a beginning point in the universe, you know how when you throw a rock in the pond and there's ripples? If you were at the right time in the right place, if you looked down and looked at a ripple, you would be able to measure and time it and trace it back to its origin, and it could even tell you something about the size and the velocity of what caused the ripple. Does that make sense? If you had enough data to work off of, you could say, well, that must have been about a 3-pound rock hurled by a 4-year-old at about 6 feet. You know what I mean? Because it's going to have a fairly consistent result. So they said, if this radiation thing's a real deal, there ought to be this ripple effect, and you ought to be able to see a pattern emerging. Not just radiation everywhere, but ripples coming out. Well, in 1989, the satellites launched, and they find not only the radiation, of course, but they're able to use the higher resolution and find it has ripples. This was such a big deal that many called it the machining marks of creation. This is a piece of plastic. One of our friends in Sweetwater, Texas, works for Ludlam's Technology, where they shocked to find out that a lot of the world's radioactive detectors, radiation detectors, are made in Sweetwater, Texas. Well, one of the things that they do is they have certain plastics that give off light under certain sorts of attacks by some of it's gamma ray, some of it's I don't know what all. So one of our friends works there, and he gave me a piece of this plastic. So I am not radioactive. But if I were to pass this around, you can probably see from a distance how one side sort of looks frosted versus the other is clear. Well, if I pass this around, you would see marks, and you know what that is. Those are what we would call machining marks. That's where it's been cut with a tool. If you were an archaeologist and you were digging around and you found a rock that was carved, you'd get all excited because the tool marks would be evidence of man's presence, and even more exciting, you would find it as evidence of some intelligent purpose. In other words, most people carve on a rock for a reason. By the way, for Bible readers out there, it's kind of interesting that one of the things that God required when they made altars was that they were untooled stones. They were natural stones. He didn't want tool marks in it because he said, this is my altar, not yours. Which later he'll talk about no graven images. That one's just for fun. But if you see tool marks, you're like, uh-oh, somebody's worked on this on purpose. This is not a natural process. And so you have a cosmological or space view of tool marks from creation, because the ripple's not just there, they're spaced just right, so that scientists say if the spacing had been any different, you'd have either had too much mass gathering in one place, which would have developed crushing gravity, or you wouldn't have had enough for matter to even coalesce. That everything's just right, like machine marks. You can look that up on the internet, the COBE, the Background Explorer. Finally, this is not a picture of me on a bad hair day. The E stands for Albert Einstein, who, of course, discovered a theory of relativity. This was something that started this process, this idea about the conservation of matter and yet the release of energy. So an example would be if you take a chunk of firewood and you set it on fire on one of these nice, cool evenings, this theory says you can't destroy matter. You can transform it. So you go from a chunk of wood to a pile of ash, but in that transformation is a significant release of energy. And when that energy's been released, it's gone. You can't catch it in your hand and bring it back. This is what became the concept or the foundational concept for what would be the modern science of observation and drawing conclusions based on a cause. So, here's the big question. We could keep going with other examples out in the universe, but we can talk about the second law of thermodynamics says, like a clock or like your car, everything's going to run out of fuel, which means the universe has not always existed. If the universe has not always existed, then it had a beginning. If it had a beginning, how did it begin? You either have an eternal God or an eternal universe. So as far as the beginning, we could say, well, there's the fact that your car runs out of gas, so does the universe. You could say, our universe is getting bigger, which means if you rewind, it was smaller. It had a beginning point. You could talk about the radiation. There's the effect out in space, the history of a beginning point, of a massive, sudden introduction of energy into our universe. Where did that come from? How did that happen? A more refined version are the galaxy seeds. And then there's just this idea about how matter cannot be destroyed, merely transformed, and then energy is either released or consumed. So the question is, if there is no God, then why is there something rather than nothing? Because if there's no God, why is there anything? All of this and no God? Because we have to, if the universe had a beginning, it had a cause. What would be the cause if there's no God? Which we'll, of course, be exploring. So again, either no one created something out of nothing. Is that a difficult statement to believe? So the universe had a beginning, and it came from nothing, but it just happened. That's one option. Or someone created something out of nothing. That's challenging too, but I would suggest it takes less faith to believe the second one than the first. So for next week, two really easy questions. Because it's fair when I say, look, either God's always existed or the universe has always existed. Somebody says, wait a minute, you say I can't have an eternal universe. How come you get to have an eternal God? Because where did God come from? It's a good question. And a fair one. For tonight, what we can say is, yeah, but the evidence says, the scientific evidence, not just fantasy, that the evidence says the universe has not always existed. That's not a viable option. For the 5 reasons we've discussed and many others. Which will lead us to the idea of the complexity of life. So are we merely an accident, or are we intelligently caused? Paul says, God's invisible attributes, the nature of God that you cannot see, can be, he says, understood through what has been made. And that's what we'll spend some time doing.